So we got double lecture today, woo! And then we'll probably have a little bit of lecture on Monday, and then I'll answer any questions you might have, that you've come up with, anything we need to review. We'll do that on Monday, and then the full period on Wednesday will be for the exam. And like I said, especially this one where you don't have math, I don't expect most of you to take more than an hour, but you've got it if you want it. So you can take your time. If you want to take your time, you have that time. I think that's it. Any questions or announcements? Okay, then last time we talked about populations and how they're usually not evenly spread across the landscapes, and so we have different models that try to account for that. And specifically, we spent our time talking about the metapopulation model, and now we're moving on. The rest of this PowerPoint is population statistics or demography, basically. We're going to talk about density, dispersion, dispersal, and also sex ratio and age ratios, and why those might be important, why we might be interested in them. All right, so it's a lot of, we're not going to do stats, but these are statistics you might measure about a population. All right. The first one is population density. And so I think I threw out the definition of straight up density last time, number of individuals per unit area, that's density. But, and there's some problems with being too dense or not dense enough. And so if you're too dense, you can spread disease. If you're not dense enough, whoops, gotta get up there, then you could have trouble finding a mate or avoiding predators. If you are a gregarious species and you're out on your own, you might be more vulnerable to predation and things like that. So there is kind of like an optimum density that works pretty well in populations. But most of what I want to focus on is the density as defined right here, number of individuals per unit area. In ecology, we refer to that as the crude density. And it is the crude density because, as we were talking about when we discussed scale and as we discussed metapopulations, things are not evenly distributed across a landscape the majority of the time. And so while we can estimate the number of individuals per acre or hectare or whatever we want to do, it's likely that they are not occupying that entire space, but rather parts of that area that are appropriate habitat for them. Okay. And so it gives you an example. Goldenrods in a field might grow in clumps. And so you can estimate how many goldenrods you have per 10 meter by 10 meter quadrat if you wanted to, but it's not really going to represent what goldenrods are doing very well. All right. And so no matter how uniform the habitat may appear, it usually is patchy because of different microclimates. Not just microclimates, but also in the case of the goldenrods, it can be nutrients in the soil. Maybe there's different calcium deposits or a moisture gradient or any number of things that could be controlling where those plants, in this case, are located. Instead, what we should do is calculate ecological density. Ecological density is the number of individuals per available living space. Per available living space, not unit area. It becomes a unit area, but not per just raw, straight up unit area. And so that means in the case of the goldenrod, you would need to figure out what are the habitat requirements for the goldenrod, measure how much of that habitat you have, and then how many goldenrods do you have per appropriate habitat for goldenrods. That's what ecological density would be. This gives an example of bobwhites per mile of hedgerow rather than bobwhites per hectare. So it's trying to get down, nail down more to the habitat that they're actually going to be occupying. Which one of these do you think we measure most often? Which one's easier?
Crude.
Crude density is way easier. I could just go do point counts, right? Park my car on the road, write down what I hear, move on. Not really pay attention to where they're coming from, what parts of the habitat around me they're using. It's a lot easier. And so crude density is difficult. It is difficult to measure available living space. Therefore, we measure crude density most often. That seems a little confusing now that I'm looking at it. So most often we do crude density because it's really hard to quantify and the available living space. All right, any questions about that? Something to keep in mind. When you do something like point counts for birds, that's just where you stand in a single location and write down everything you see and hear. You probably have an idea of your surrounding habitat, and it gives you a good idea of diversity in those areas. But it is true, if you've got a variety of habitats and you're getting field sparrows, which like fields, if you don't know, and you get white-throated sparrows, which like forests, at the same spot, you're not doing very good at delineating between the two. Right. All right, so what are the impacts of density? Or what impacts density? One is the body size. Some of these, to me, the slide when we talk about density is common sense, but let's see if our common sense is working. Mine might not be. I'm still a little fuzzy. Body size. Smaller animals tend to have higher density than larger animals. For one thing, larger animals need more food and resources than smaller animals. So you're going to have more mice per acre than you're going to have deer per acre. So that's pretty common sense, right? You see what I'm saying? It just makes sense. Trophic level is important. So predators tend to be less dense than herbivores. Also should make sense because if you had the same number of predators as you had herbivores, the predators would be in trouble, right? They wouldn't have enough to eat. And so predators tend to be sparse across the landscape, and the prey tend to be much more abundant, much more dense across the landscape. I had one more on there, but I don't see one popping up. We must hit it later. I think later we talk a little bit about differences between ectotherms and endotherms. That can also impact your density in that they have different energetic needs. But it's not on that list, so don't worry about it yet. Okay, so this slide is some of the things that density influences, like your energy flow, resource availability, physiological stress is a big one, which we don't spend a lot of time on in this class, but they've done research with mice, for example, and they show that if they're overpopulated, then I think it's the males. I could have it backwards. Anyway, there are hormones released that will suppress reproduction to try to get the density back under control. So they're just talking about physiological, well, you know, in the human population, especially when we have things like heat waves in big cities, where you have people all compacted, and then you have a power outage, and then you have an increase in rise and tension and stuff like that. That's what it's talking about here. The same types of things happen in wild populations. Dispersal, which is one of the topics we'll cover a little bit, and that's going to be immigrating in and out of a population, depending on its density. And then the productivity itself is going to be impacted by density. So if you have too many bluegill in a pond, what happens to the productivity there? Do the bluegill grow and put on mass? That's what productivity is. No, they become stunted and weird. All right. Any questions about density? I don't know. I checked. I don't have COVID. I don't know what I picked up, but my head's been foggy for about 2 days. It could just be allergy. I don't know. I don't know what it is. But I feel better today than I did yesterday. All right, next up. Spatial dispersion. Maybe this will pep me up because I'm going to talk a lot about osprey. That'll make me happy. And like I said, I just be very careful. They're very different things, but be careful with the 3Ds. So we just did density. Now we're doing dispersion, and then we will do dispersal. So just keep them all separate. Most often confused on the exams, and I don't think it's the concepts that are confused. I think it's just the term. But dispersal and dispersion are most commonly swapped. So just be careful. Make sure when you're taking your exam, you check your word. Make sure you have the right one. All right. Spatial dispersion is how individuals are arranged per unit area. And it's what's going to help you get closer to being aware of things like ecological density, right? We're going in and we're taking a closer look at where these organisms are actually going to be occurring. And so I do have the picture of the osprey. This one, the picture was taken at Rowfoot Lake. This is one of the nests we watched out there. And we did a dispersion study on them that I'm going to tell you about a little bit later. But first, we just need to get a few definitions down, and then we'll talk about it. All right? So we're going to talk about 3 types of dispersion. The first one is uniform. also sometimes called regular. And this is where the individuals are spread evenly, sometimes also called evenly across the environment. And this is giving you some pictures of some birds that are territorial only around their nest site. And it causes them to be remarkably spaced, like the spacing is remarkably similar. Like the space between this nest and this nest and this nest and this nest is almost equal everywhere within their little colony. We can look at it at larger scales if we looked at territoriality in birds. So if we mapped out the robins on the quad, we would see the same type of pattern. We would see this territory and this territory and this territory, and it would cause them to be uniformly dispersed across the quad. Not during the winter, but during the summer. During the winter, what are they? They're all in a single tree pooping, right? That's what they do in the winter. Okay, well, making droppings. This is often the result of things like territoriality and a result of interest-specific competition, meaning that they are competing with members of the same species, but also tend to have, associated with that, they tend to have an intolerance. And so if you think about big cats, for example, they don't tend to tolerate other big cats in the area where they roam. And so if you looked at them, you'd have to be on a larger landscape scale again. They're going to be somewhat uniformly spaced because they're intolerant of each other, right? That kind of thing. All right, the next one is random. And in the case of random, get it all up there, we get a definition that comes from statistics, that one individual's position does not depend on another individual's position. And so they're not aggravated by each other's presence, but they also don't have a desire to be together per se. And so they're just ambling around, and if they run into somebody, they don't care either way. They'll just keep on moving. And so sometimes they might be close together, and sometimes they may be far apart. This gives the example of spiders, like wolf spiders, things like that just kind of amble along looking for prey, constantly on the move. They're not territorial in any way. The other example that we have here are the mussels. And so mussels and clams, they have a larval stage that is planktonic, which means that it floats in the water column. And then wherever those larvae tend to settle is where the adult will end up being. And so they're not moving around a lot after they settle, and that gives them somewhat of a random dispersion pattern. At the bottom of the slide, you can see that this pattern is thought to be rare because the environment has to be uniform for this to really truly work. In other words, they have to be able to find resources no matter where they wander, and that's usually not truly the case. The resources have to be equally available all throughout the year. So that's what a textbook's going to tell you. I would say that you could get more specific. And so we could look at their pattern, their dispersion pattern in the summer, and we might see that they are uniform, territorial, because they're breeding, like we're talking about birds. And then in the winter, like I was just hinting at, robins are going to flock together. That changes their dispersion pattern, right? And they could become random. They don't, but they could become random, and so forth. And so I think I understand what they're trying to say. They're trying to say if you're wandering around ambly and you're truly random all the time, all year long, then you need to have your resources have to be equally available all the time. Does that make sense? So it's a place where I'm kind of, the textbook is getting too rigid, I think, in some ways. All right. There's no pattern of attraction avoidance. That's what I've been trying to get into. They don't care if the other one's nearby. Either way, they don't want to go say, hey, let's hang out together for a while. They don't really do that, but they also don't like go attack them because they're close. So no patterns like that. All right, when the robins do get together in the winter and they begin flocking, that creates what are called clumps, clump dispersion pattern. There are several names for this one, so that's what's in the parentheses, also sometimes called clustered, contagious, which I think is a funny one, or aggregated. This is the most common pattern that you tend to see in the environment. And there's lots of reasons why. And so the top picture is showing you a family unit extended family unit probably, of elephants that are going to be moving around together as a group. In other words, it is on here somewhere. Social behavior keeps them together. A lot of your primates are like that, right? They're gregarious, they hang out together. Yeah, just for Brian. At the bottom of the slide, we've got cedar waxwings. The cedar waxwings eat berries, and then what they do is they'll find a tree, and they'll all be in that tree, hundreds of them. And then they'll eat all the berries, and they'll move on to another tree. So they are moving according to resources. Well, it's not specifically, I guess it'd fall into that first one, habitat differences. And there's a lot of animals that do that as well. So you could also, if you're looking at the elephants at the top, we could also go back to that's a watering hole. And watering holes are a resource that, if you live in an arid environment, becomes very precious, and so all the animals tend to accumulate there. And so you get that kind of pattern. Kind of the extreme of being clumped is, that I want to mention just briefly, is you get these groups of birds like this, or fish. I have a bird picture and a fish picture. It's called a murmuration. Now these are really interesting to watch. There's lots of interesting patterns that you can see. If you go online, they'll show you the ones where you have a flock of birds that look like a giant bird and stuff like that. And what's happening is often it makes them look like they're moving as a single unit rather than as individuals. And it makes it hard for a predator, for example, which is what's happening in both of these pictures, to locate and target a single individual. And so at the top, I believe we're looking at ducks or geese. And you can see the hawk or eagle, can't tell which one it is from here, on the outside of the murmuration. That's what's caused them to get up into the air. At Reelfoot, when I stop and ask the rangers, have they seen anything, like where are the snow geese? That's what I usually ask them, where are the snow geese? They'll say, I saw a tornado with snow geese. That's what they're talking about. They saw murmuration. This one, of course, you can see looks like a shark in the middle of those fishes. And even looking at it, it's hard to pick out those individuals. All right. So like I said, we've done a couple of studies on osprey now, but the one I want to talk about was done several years ago by a student named Rachel Washniak. She got married. When she was here, she was Rachel Mowbray. She has her master's now. She looked at stopover ecology of songbirds in Georgia, somewhere near Savannah, for her graduate work. I'm not exactly sure what her current job is. Well, I could show you a picture of her. There she is. And so she decided she wanted to do an undergraduate research project, and she came to me in the fall. And the fall can be difficult for birds because we're not breeding, right? They're not going through their breeding season. We do some winter ecology stuff, and then I get roped into owls, which I've been roped into owls again this year because they breed over the winter time. And so they're getting vocal right now. If you're outside, they're really starting, especially the barred owls, really cranking up, starting to do lots of hollering. And so I thought, why don't we go out to Reelfoot and we will look at the dispersion pattern of the nests of the osprey, because it's safer to approach them after the end of the breeding season than during the breeding season for lots of reasons. For one, you can disrupt their breeding activities, and for two, they can get a little aggressive if you get too close to them. And so that's what we did, and I thought it would take us like, I don't know, a couple of weekends. We find 20 nests or so, and it took us like a month and a half, and we found over 50 nests that'll be in there somewhere. So we found a lot more nests than I thought, which is good. That's good news. And so osprey live on live fish. They are specialists in that way. They don't like dead fish. They like to catch actively swimming fish. And you've probably seen pictures, but they're able to fold their bodies and extend their legs so that they can go down and they can catch a fish up to a meter deep and still come up and fly away with it. It's pretty impressive. That makes them completely adapted in a different way from bald eagles. And so when you see a giant nest like this that's out on the water, that's an osprey nest. Osprey are not able to fly around branches to land. They have to have an open landing platform because they're so adapted for diving for fish. And so when you see the big, huge nest, usually on the shore or on the levee at Reelfoot, and it's in the center of the tree, that's going to be an eagle nest. So they nest in different places. Although this summer, my understanding is one of the osprey nests at Kirby Pocket at Reelfoot was occupied by bald eagle. It's just kind of a little strange. They were highly impacted by DDT. So DDT was a pesticide that we used to help control mosquitoes, and it caused the shells to thin, so they went to incubate their eggs, and then they just crushed their eggs. And so osprey went all but extinct in Tennessee for a while. And then we did some hacking programs, which sounds terrible. It sounds like we're chopping the birds up. But really what a hacking program is that they're hatching the eggs, they're raising them. You've probably seen it with the condors, where they don't have access with humans. They use puppets and things, and then they release them back into the wild and stuff like that. So they did that kind of stuff, including at Reelfoot. There was a couple of hacking towers there. But as I kind of told you, they seem to be doing pretty well at Reelfoot now. All right. So we've already gone over this information, but I want you to look for it in a different way. And so the definitions at the top are very similar to what we've already talked about, but the statistic that we're going to use to determine our dispersion pattern is going to be based on the distance between the nests, okay? And so if we start over here, if we measure the distance between this nest and this nest, and then the distance between this nest and this nest, and then the distance between this nest and this nest, and we run some statistics, what we would expect is that the distance between nests are uniform. They're almost all the same. There's very low variation between the distances between the nests, and it's proportional to the area that we sampled. Right? Does everybody follow that? Okay. Whereas over here, if we measure the distance between, what we did is we measured the distance to the nearest nest. I guess I should have been more specific. And so we measured the distance to the one that's nearest here, the one that's nearest here, the one that's nearest here. In other words, we're never going to have this distance in our data set because it's never going to be the nearest nest in a clump. And so what you got were the distances between the nests were small compared to your overall area. And again, not a lot of variation in the distances, low variation. And then if we go over here in the middle, if you do the distance between this nest and this nest as being the closest, this one looks like it's closer, so this one and this one, this one and this one, then what you get in a random dispersion is you get the highest amount of variation because some will be close together and some will be far apart, and it won't be as proportional to your overall area. Okay, does that make sense? Any questions about that? So what we needed to do for the statistics we ran is we needed to know about those distances to the nearest neighboring nests. That's what we were measuring. All right. And so osprey are known to nest in colonies, which means that our hypothesis would be that they were clumped. Okay. Most of the information about ospreys, though, takes place, or the research has been done in coastal communities, so those that are living along the coast. If you go down to the Gulf Coast, especially in the winter, that's where a lot of our birds go. You see lots and lots and lots of osprey. I did see an osprey 2 weeks ago still in Tennessee, so they're still hanging around. I would not be floored if you told me you saw an osprey in the winter, but generally speaking, we don't. I rarely see one in the winter at Reelfoot. But in the summer, you see them all the time everywhere. All right. And so there are several hypotheses as to why they might live in colonies. And so one of them is maybe they're putting the colony near where they fish. I think that one's also kind of popular amongst the fishermen. They tend to like to fish around the osprey because they know that osprey catch fish, which is true. But from what Skylar did summer before last, they will go hunt near their nest, but they're not necessarily picking up big fish. They're probably just picking up little fish. Most of the big fish is coming from somewhere else. So really what you want to do is follow the osprey and figure out where it's picking up its big fish, right? Not necessarily fish right underneath them. The information center hypothesis is what I just said, basically. And that is, if you are having a bad day and you can't find fish and your neighbor keeps coming home with fish, then follow them and you'll find out where to get the big fish. Whereas if you were in a nest all by yourself and you couldn't see your neighbors, then you wouldn't get that information. You would just continue hunting to try to find a fish, which could potentially make you less successful. Right? And then the nest site hypothesis is that they're nesting where there are appropriate nest sites. Okay? And at Reelfoot, what they do is they nest at the top of cypress trees. The cypress tree's top has often been broken. It forms a platform that will support the nest. And their nests are reused from one year to the next. They do reuse them. All right. And so here's a little bit more about reelfoot. We do have a large inland breeding population. They're summer residents, as I said, and most of their nests are like this in the top of bald cypress trees. Okay? And this picture is just showing you about the supports. So some of them it's more obvious than others. You can see that this is a dead cypress tree, but you can see the obvious supports that are holding up the nests. That's something I don't have in this presentation because it's something Skylar measured, but we counted the supports and estimated the diameter of the supports on the nests 2 summers ago. So we've done that as well. All right. And so our goals for this project were to map the nests in the 4 main basins of Reelfoot Lake, which is Upper Blue Basin, Lower Blue Basin, Middle Basin, and Buck Basin. That was our goal. And then you'll notice we determined the spatial dispersion in Middle Basin, Buck Basin, and Upper Blue Basin. Lower Blue Basin is omitted here because there were only, I think, 3 total nests in the whole basin. If you don't know anything about Reelfoot, that's the deepest basin, and it doesn't have as many standing cypress trees as the other basins. It doesn't have appropriate habitat, in other words. And so we didn't do any statistical analysis on Lower Blue Basin. To measure the nest site characteristics, we had to get really close to the trees. There's Rachel getting really close to the tree. And we measured things such as the diameter, which is tricky on cypress trees, so we just did the best we can. You can see in this picture that they, buttress at the bottom. We did things like measure the height of the tree, and to do that, we measured the height above water and then measured the water depth so that we actually had the height of the tree. Same for the height of the nest, and a variety of other things. So we did a nest site characterization on each of the trees, as well as get the GPS coordinates. All right. And then we mapped them. And so here's what we came up with. And here's Lower Blue Basin. I think this is just a single nest here. That's near the state park. They would take their pontoon boat by that one regularly. I think that one's moved from that position. And then this is 2. They're just so close together they look overlapped on this map. That's 2 nests over at Champy Pocket. And that's all that we found on Lower Blue Basin. But you can see Middle Basin, Buck Basin, and Upper Blue Basin, we found lots of nests. This is on a very large scale so that you can see all the basins. You see the white box in Middle Basin. To show you how much overlap we have, we took that area within that white box and we blew it up on this slide. And as you're looking at what's happening here, where the trees are the most clustered, in other words, densest, you don't find osprey nests, and it's for the reason that we talked about before. They can't fly in there and land on a nest because of their fishing adaptations to their anatomy, essentially. All right, so what did we find out? Some of the stuff is just statistics. So this just characterized the tree height, nest height, diameter of the nest. Notice that the tree height and the nest height is actually fairly low. This is in meters, so they're mostly in short trees. Some of them not very far off the water at all, like this. So the nest is just right above her head at the very top of that tree. So they're pretty short. We also measured the nearest tree to the nest, which is sometimes can be quite close, but often pretty far away. And then, of course, the nearest neighboring nest. Then we started to do some statistics comparing between the basins, between Upper Blue Basin, Middle Basin, and Buck Basin. So this is just comparing averages. That's what an ANOVA does. It compares the averages. And you'll notice the only difference that we have here is right here. The nearest neighboring nests were fairly close together in Upper Blue and Middle Basin, but they were far apart over there in Buck Basin, which is going to impact their dispersion pattern. Okay. And so to determine the spatial dispersion, we estimated the area using a math website. So that's where these red lines came from. We outline the basin, and then you take the diagonal across the basin, you plug those numbers into the website, and it gives you the area. So that's how we got the area. We did all that in Google Earth. And then we used let's see if we can get right. We determined spatial dispersion using the Donnelly modification of the Clark and Evans test. That's the actual name of the statistical test that we used. And again, that's based on distance between nearest neighboring nests. All right? And when we did that, what we found, statistically speaking, is that middle basin is clumped, which we weren't terribly surprised by that. This is definitely a colony here, and you have a colony up here, and you have a few that are off on their own. Upper blue basin came out as clumped, but it's weird. And so you can even see it in the picture here. You see how the nests all line up and form an S-shaped? And so what you have is a basin that has a row of cypress trees that divides it. And the birds are using every tree available to them, not every tree, but they're putting their nest regularly along that line of trees. And so there's no trees on either side of that, is what I'm saying. So they're very linear. And so statistically, if you're measuring between this nest and its nearest neighbor, it's always going to be the one right next to it, but it's not really making a traditional clump, right? So while statistically that one comes out clumped, it's odd. It's not a traditional clump. And then buck basin comes out as random. Now it looks like you have a little bit of clumping right here, but it doesn't have as much overlap. Like you're seeing most of the nest here, whereas here this is several nests overlapped on top of each other. So they're a little bit more widely spaced. And then you have some nests that are located quite far from those groups. And so statistically, that one comes out as the nest being further apart and therefore randomly dispersed. And so how did we interpret all that? Well, we feel like that this probably supports the nest site hypothesis, that probably what's driving them more than anything else is finding a tree that has the appropriate characteristics for them to build a nest on. That would also help us explain why you did have some nests over in the lower blue basin. You had the 3 nests, one of them completely isolated over by the state park. And so anywhere that they can put a nest, they put a nest, essentially. That's what I'm saying. But in the future, we would like to compare the success rate. So I'm really getting more into the next slide. The success rate of osprey that are living in a very obvious colony, like that one we have in Middle Basin, to those that are living quite far away from the colonies, to see if there's any support for the information center hypothesis. In other words, if you're in the colony, are you bringing more fish to your offspring more often than in ones that are located further away? After doing Schuyler's research, I don't think that Reelfoot is going to be the best place to do that research. And the reason for that is because Reelfoot is ideal osprey habitat. It's shallow, it's full of fish, it gets depleted of oxygen during the summer, and so the fish are kind of up near the top a lot. And we had several nests that were able to raise 3 babies, right? Which is really unusual, because what the raptors typically do is they'll lay 2 or 3 eggs, and most of the time, if you read your textbooks again, they're going to tell you they'll fledge 1. And then you have some siblicide, which we will talk about sometime in this class, that takes place that leads to that. However, if there's enough food, then they might be able to raise 2, and then very rarely 3. And what we were finding at Reelfoot is it wasn't very rare for them to have 3, which means they weren't having any trouble finding fish feeding their babies for the most part. Other things, we did have a lot of unsuccessful nests, but it probably wasn't related to the fishing. It could probably related to other things, interference from eagles, and then we saw them interact with fish crows quite a lot too for some reason. All right, and so this research did have some funding, and then we have to thank people for helping us do the project. And then Rachel cracked me up because she looks fit, but she was weak. And I would like go towards the tree, and I would cut the motor, and we're just cruising. And then her job was to grab the branch, and then so that we could do the measurements. And so the tree won. We're like keeping statistics on how many times the tree won and how many times Rachel won. And the trees were winning far more often than Rachel. And so this is one of the times that I cut the motor. We're cruising in very slowly, and I look up, and this is what I see. But she wasn't permanently harmed. She's fine. All right, any questions about dispersion or how you might apply these types of things? And that's kind of my point of sharing these projects, is you can actually take this and do things with it. Okay. And one time we pulled the boat out, and it wasn't centered on the trailer. And you could tell from looking at it, we don't have much stuff in the boat. It's light. And so I was like, I don't want to put it back in the water. Let's just pull it over. And so she was on one side. I think she was going to pull, and I was going to push. And then I realized I was lifting the boat off the trailer, and it wasn't moving because she couldn't pull it. I was like, come on, get to the gym. All right. We had a good time though. So that's dispersion. That's what we've discussed so far with the osprey nest and our general definitions is what we're usually referring to. That's called spatial dispersion. And so how things are arranged on the landscape. We could also look at temporal dispersion and how things are arranged in time, right? A temporal rift means you're going to go back in time if you're on Star Trek, or forward in time. And so organisms have migrations, for example. We're going to talk about migrations as we discuss dispersal. And so they are different places at different times of the year. But it could also be daily movements. So if you're a bat, you're clustered in your cave during the day, and then at night you come out and spread out probably more randomly as you go hunting. And so there are things that affect the temporal, that do separate species temporally. All right. Then some other factors that can affect it could include things like lunar and tidal cycles, which we've talked about before. Then last night we had an eclipse. Anybody go out and see it? We had a lunar eclipse. One person. I went out. Did you up?
No, I said I had no idea the group all posted pictures.
Yeah. Yeah, I went out. I was not feeling well, but I went out to walk my dog, and it had just started, so this part of it was eclipsed. I don't think we were total, though.
No, we only had like 8%.
8%? Well, I may have been close to peak then.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can see, I could tell it was eclipsing, and then I was like, I gotta go to bed.
Yeah, just took a little tiny shot from the border, and then that was it.
Oh, well then, I totally saw it.
Yeah.
I saw that. I saw that. Yep, I saw the whole thing. I thought it said it was peaking at 11. I thought.
Easter.
Okay, so 10.
11.
Well, yeah, I checked it at 10. It was 10 o'clock when I took the dog out. So I saw it.
Yeah.
I didn't realize I saw it. I mean, I knew I saw. I just didn't realize that was all of it. Okay. All right, we're switching D's again. Moving on to dispersal. Okay, so be careful. Dispersal. This is leaving one area and going somewhere else. And so we have immigration, and then we have immigration, and then we have migration. Those are the big three. All right. And so immigration, which is really pronounced more like immigration, but immigration is one way out of the habitat permanently, so you're not going to return. I remember that one because E for exit, right? E for exit, so they're exiting the habitat permanently. Immigration, they're coming in permanently. And so that's into or in immigration. And then migration is you're going to leave and come back. And come back and leave, come back, back and forth. And so that's dispersal with a return to the place where you started. Right? And for some of the birds, that's very specific. So we were doing research with yellow-breasted chats when I was in grad school, and they were color-banded population, and they would have a bush that they use, fly down to South America and come back to that same bush. Not even just the same state, same bush, and use it again the next year. It's kind of crazy. That's called site fidelity, and they have high site fidelity in that particular species. Dispersal can be passive or active. And so what does that mean? What's passive?
It just kind of happens.
It just happens, right? And so that would be like blown in the wind. Would be passive. Can you give an example of an animal that's passively dispersed?
Mussels.
What now?
Mussels.
Yeah, they're water, dispersed by water.
Some spiders.
I was thinking spiders and they're parachuting. They're wind dispersed. Okay, so yes, passive dispersal, wind and water. What's active?
Like active.
You just get up and move. Yeah, you just get up and move. So animals are good at active dispersal. And so you just get up and fly 10,000 miles to a new place and hang out for a while. 10,000 miles is on the high side for birds. Okay? So that's what it means by being passive or active. As we're talking about animals, there are some animals, as we've said, like mussels and spiders, that are passively dispersed. But animals can move around. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about is active dispersal. So as we go to the next slide, we talk about natal dispersal versus breeding dispersal. This is another place that I don't think is tricky, but just make sure that you study it enough that you can tell them apart. Natal dispersal is dispersal of young from where they were born. And so if you were born and you spent your whole life in the same city, then when you came to college, that would have been your natal dispersal. I said it like that because that's not what happened to me. We moved around every couple of years, so I moved a lot of places since before I went to college. Breeding dispersal is movement of adults from a poor to a better reproductive site. So that's like right now, you've got this apartment, it's awesome, and you're going to remember it for the rest of your life, tell your kids about it. But most likely before you have kids, you're going to buy a house, right? You're going to upgrade your reproductive site, not that you're reproducing now. All right. It says you go from your single wide to a double wide to the mansion. Okay, so that's the difference. Dispersers are often seeking vacant habitats, and the distance they travel will depend on density. So going back and getting that one again. And unoccupied sites, which is available of suitable unoccupied sites. So density is going to affect that too. What's kind of crazy though, that we're going to learn on the next slide, is they don't move very far. The human population has changed in that regard. It used to be, you were born and then you lived pretty close to your family unit. Kind of like that old TV show, Everybody Loves Raymond, where he was across the street from his parents. He didn't disperse very far. But nowadays we tend, because we tend to choose our job based on what we want to do, and our job may or may not be available to you in your hometown. So we tend to disperse a little farther. So general rule of thumb is to move to the first uncontested site and no further. So like I said, the first vacancy. And so the little guys on the bottom of the slide, aren't they adorable? Look at the little tufts on their ears. Those are red squirrels. I'm getting all up there. Is it all up there now? Yeah. And there was a study done in 1994 where they monitored 205 red squirrels in Canada. And what they did is they probably had radio trackers on them. And they found that the squirrels would go out and explore, look for unoccupied sites. So they weren't necessarily just settling on the first site they found. They were looking around. And they might go up to about 900 meters away from where their natal territory is, where their mama is. But even though they went out and explored, about half of them settled either on their mom's territory or right next door. In other words, Everybody Loves Raymond, right across the street. The furthest distance settled by a young squirrel was 323 meters, or about 3 territories, 3 houses down the road. So not very far. They're not dispersing all that far. Move to the first uncontested site and no further. All right, any questions about that? Sticking with dispersal, let's talk about some of those migratory movements. There are daily migration patterns that we can study. And I've hinted at those already. That's why I have the picture of the bat cave. Zooplankton move up and down in the water column. I think I have it written down because I always forget the order because it's not really my area. Down the water column during the day and up at night. Some of you in limnology might be looking at that. Bats go out and hunt at night and then come back to their cave or wherever they roost in the daytime. So that's a daily migratory movement. We can have a seasonal migration, which we are experiencing right now. Birds are moving in large numbers. It's lights out time. If you don't know what that means turn out all your extraneous light and close your curtains so that they don't crash into your windows. Most birds migrate at night because they're using stars and other things. But when I ask you questions on the exam, make sure you're very specific because we could have different types of seasonal migrations. We'll start with a short-range seasonal migration. Might not think about those earthworms. Well, we've talked about them a lot in this class. But they move deeper down into the soil during the winter, coil into little balls, wait it out, and then move back up to the surface. Probably your more classic example of seasonal migration is altitudinal migration. And so there's lots of species. This one talks about elk that will spend the summers at high elevation and the winters at lower elevation when it's really cold and not much food at the high elevations. So when I went to Yellowstone, I was all bummed out because I didn't see any moose. They were all at high elevation. But then I saw moose in Alaska, so I'm okay now. So altitudinal, there's a lot of research done on black-capped chickadees in the Appalachian Mountains. They have very strong altitudinal migration that they perform, so there's lots of examples. We can have a long-range seasonal migration. That is probably what comes into people's minds right away. But just to throw you off track, my first example are whales. It's specifically gray whales, which move from the Arctic water up to the coast of California. And it's changing food sources that's driving that one. And then, of course, as I've already mentioned, we have our neotropical migratory birds, which are currently migrating between North America going down into South America. I don't know. I kind of... We had a cold front 2 weeks ago. And then we had the hurricane this week. The hurricane did not blow up any flamingos. But there were several rare gull species that got blown up by the hurricane. Specifically, they were very excited about a Sabine's gull. I think it was in Middle Tennessee. But for whatever reason, I've had a wave of hummingbirds this week. I don't really know why. Usually you can predict it because you'll get a cold front. So maybe there's a cool front north of us that's not impacting us. They were insane this morning. I had to put up some food before I left. And so we got a wave. So the ones that are eating at my feeder right now are not the ones that were here this summer. They've already moved. So these are ones that bred up north somewhere. So they're coming through in waves. Last night I was in my hammock and I heard summer tanager and a wide-eyed vireo, and I was like, oh. It's probably not the summer tanager that spent all summer with me. Again, it's probably one that was up north. But I was just thinking it's only a short period of time left, and then I won't hear them all winter. I'll be all sad.
We visited a property the weekend, and instead of looking at everything that only had to do with habitat management like I was supposed to, I was taking note of like every single bird I heard, and they had a lot of wide-eyed vireos.
Yeah, the wide-eyed vireos have been very loud. They're moving, and so I guess their population is up over what it was in the summer. I noticed that when I went hiking at Land Between the Lakes 2 weeks ago, there were tons of wide-eyed vireos calling. I will miss them soon. They'll be gone. They're leaving. All right. So that's your seasonal migration, short range and long range. Some other types of migratory movements. This one is the sad one, a migration with just one return trip. So they don't do it every year. They just do it once. And you got all the Pacific salmon species there, the pinks, sockeye, chinook, chum, and kobo. Anyway, what the Pacific salmon do is they spawn in freshwater, and then they swim out into the sea, into salt water. They reach sexually maturity in salt water, and they become very much adapted to the saltwater environment. And then they can find the stream that they were born, swim up the stream, but as soon as they hit that stream, they start to die because they're not adapted for living in fresh water. And so they are dying as they swim up the stream, make it back to the pool where they were born, lay their eggs, the male releases his sperm, and then they just die. I know, right? It's very, very strange in that regard. But they don't just go out for a year. They're out in the ocean for quite a long time. It's different depending on the species. So they're out in the ocean for a long time, putting on mass, getting large, and getting strong enough to be able to make that swim up the freshwater stream to breed. What now?
Imagine not making it.
Yeah, a lot of them don't make it, and it all happens during a very short time. And so the bears know that, and we know that. And so a lot of them get eaten and fished out.
One job and you don't do it.
Yep, and you only get one shot. One shot and
That's what I'm
done.
saying, like, that would suck.
Or you get a dam placed on your river,
Yeah.
right? Oh, I took it. I didn't think about putting it in this class. I saved a photo for ConBio. I save photos all the time, and then whether or not they make it actually into ConBio, it's hard to say. I hope this one will though. It's a fish ladder. I thought it was a really cool one. It's a fish ladder to help them get over where they block the stream.
Yeah.
It's more artistic than most of the fish ladders I've seen. Most of them are square and they're steps basically. They look more like a ladder. This one's that was a really cool.
Come on, we didn't get that in ConBio last spring.
Because I just saved it like 2 days ago, and the odds of it making it into ConBio 2 springs from now is slim. So I'm gonna try.
I didn't see it. Show me. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it's cool. I thought it was really cool. I'm sure I showed the fish ladder. I don't remember. I showed fish ladder somewhere. There's all kinds of things on my phone that never make it into class. All right, let's go ahead and finish up migratory movements, and then we'll take a break. And then we just have, I think, just a couple of small topics left. There's also this really weird, we just did a weird one, right? Salmon are weird. That doesn't happen very often. But monarchs are also a very strange migratory pattern. They are currently headed to Mexico. We need to all go to Mexico with them, right? Go see that. I want to go see that sometime. And so about 70% of the last generation move down to the highland of Mexico. They fly about 2,500 miles, these little butterflies. They fly about 2,500 miles or about 100 miles a day. I know, it's insane. And if you're paying attention, sometimes you can catch them. You'll see little groups of them pretty high up in the air. There'll be like maybe 10 floating around. Most of the time people don't really notice that so much because they're pretty high, but you'll notice that you'll see more monarchs around just generally. That's during the monarch migration. And then what they do is they begin moving northward around January, and they're going to follow the blooming of the milkweed essentially. And so they're going to move, find some milkweed, reproduce, lay eggs, reproduce, and then that next generation is going to move further north, find some milkweed, reproduce, and then that generation is going to move further north until they get as far as they can for the summer. And then whatever that last generation is, they'll fly back down to Mexico and start it over again. It's insanity, really. But that's what our little monarchs do. And down in Mexico, that's what it looks like in the highlands where they're overwintering. Totally on my bucket list. Wouldn't that be awesome? Go down there and see that. And then I have a monarch migration map that shows you a little bit about where they overwinter and where they stay. There's a lot of, I believe this is an organization, if I remember correctly, the monarch migration, because they were listed as endangered, I think like 3 or 4 years ago, officially. And so we now are studying them a little bit more heavily. There's more money for studying them and stuff like that. All right, you might want to add anything about the monarch migration, which is really strange.
They had a bunch of stopover monarch butterfly sites at the Memphis Zoo.
Yeah, they work really hard at Reelfoot too. They put in milkweed in some of their wetlands to attract them, to give them a good stopover site. So the main point of that was the ones that migrate south are several, the ones that come back in the spring are several generations removed from the ones that migrated originally. It's not the same individual. Okay, the last two things we're going to talk about is age structure and sex ratio, and then I'm going to talk to you about some of the stuff we've been doing with the bluebirds as an example. Let's take a break. I'm going to get something to drink.